धन्यवाद।
So first of all, I am very delighted to participate today in this very auspicious occasion of the Vaisakh Purnima, and this day is very significant. It's so significant that when Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar talked about the Buddha Jayanti, he talked about Buddha Jayanti very long back, and in 1941 there was a very good article that was published in what is called the Janata, and in that article it was written in Marathi, and that article was about what is called the Buddha Jayanti and its political significance. Now you can imagine that's in 1941 that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about the Buddha Jayanti and its political significance. And in that article, because we have to understand this time frame, because in 1941 our country was at the verge of getting the democratic setup, and that time there was an August offer. It was very clear that India will be ushered into a democratic country. At that time, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is making a point of saying that the Indians need to go towards the Buddha. And he gives a very lively simile there, a very good metaphor he gives there. He says that the Indians are wanting to have democracy in their country, but the India today is like a sick man, and it needs a doctor who will cleanse the live blood of the Indians. And he says that that doctor is the Buddha. And he says that if we have to realize the democracy in India, in 1941 Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says that the Indians need to chant this great mantra, the Maha Mantra, Buddhang Saranam Gacchami, Dhammang Saranam Gacchami, Sanghang Saranam Gacchami. So when we look at this 1941 article from this perspective of Buddhism, we begin to look at the thoughts of Buddhism vis-a-vis what we call democracy. And when we are thinking about democracy, which was a concern of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, all his life he worked to bring democracy in our country. So when he's talking about democracy, he's saying that if we have to have a society, it will run either on the basis of what is called the law, or the society needs morality. And the point that he's trying to make is this, and a very important point, that what is the source of morality? So he says that the source of morality is the religion. And he says that now, having had this much period in the history, we cannot expect a new prophet or a new master to come and found a new religion. So in the existing religions, we have to find the morality which will be universal morality, the morality which will be compatible with the democracy. And if we look at the other way Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has conceptualized democracy, he has equated democracy with the ethics, with the morality. And he says that the heart of the Buddha Dhamma is the morality. And then he goes on comparing the concept of, he launches what is called the comparative study of religions in a very brief manner. And that has been his lifelong passion, to have the comparative study of the religions. And he wanted to seek in religions because he thinks that the religious emotions are very important. The religious thoughts are very important because there is something in human where we have this fascination for what is called the religious experience or religious thought. So he says that if the society needs the sanction of morality, and the morality being, coming from the religion, he compares the religions, and in our case, he compares the Brahminical tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And he talks about the Dharma in terms of, the way it is conceptualized in the Brahminical societies and in Buddhism. Because as, Sumesh sir has said, that we have had this very important concept of Dhamma coming from Buddha all the way up to Ashoka, which talks about the Dhamma, which is nothing but the radical equality. Ashoka talks about, the Samanvaya, the harmony between the human beings. He doesn't talk about any categorization. And he says that the society can only be in harmony if it doesn't have this high and low as as something dividing the societies or the people. So today, when we are talking about democracy, and democracy everywhere looks to be in the shambles. For example, in our country, if we apply the tests of how the democracy is functioning in this country, we can see that the democracy is declining. There is a great division in the society. If we talk about America, the oldest democracy in the world, it's facing the same problem. And the people are talking about what is called the spiritual democracy. And long back, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar had this vision of having an ethical system which will be universal in nature and which will support his very fundamental principles of liberty, equality and fraternity. And hence, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says that if we have to have a democracy in this country, we should have this attitude of respect and reverence for a fellow human being, which comes from the teachings of the Buddha. And he says that when we are talking about the Buddha's Dhamma, it is not a religion, because in the religious tradition, the morality is like a wagon which can be changed anytime. It's not the main engine. But when it comes to Buddhism, the morality is the main driver. The morality, the Dhamma, is the heart of the Buddha's teachings. So, for example, if we look at the other religious systems, the morality is a triangular piece. There is a God at the top, and there are human beings at the two ends of the triangle. So, morality is mediated by the sanction of the God, and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar finds this idea not very much compatible, which I am going to come to the next section, where I am going to talk about. So, when he is talking about the relationship between the human beings, between one man and one man, between one man and women and women, when he's talking about those relationships, he says that there is no ground for putting any wall between the two human beings. In other words, he's talking about the universal metta. And this concept is so profoundly important today that we have to, as the scholars and the researchers, need to go back to comparative study of the religions, comparative study of the philosophical traditions, comparative study of the ideologies, to find out what kind of the universal ethics, what kind of the humanitarian social system that we all can advocate. And as Babasaheb Ambedkar said that there will not be any new prophet, we have to search in the existing religions this code of the universal morality. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar found that code of universal morality in the Buddha's Dhamma. It's very clear, and he has constructed a kind of a social theory out of his understanding of the Buddha's teachings. So now, when I was talking about the morality, a triangular piece of morality mediated by some external agency, when we are thinking about the Buddha was somebody, in fact, he was one of the first in the world to talk about what we can say the scientific or the experimental thinking. Now, the world is talking about, we as a human being experience various phenomena like rains, like thunderstorms, like floods and all. And at that time, human beings were very much puzzled as to how these various phenomena take place, why they happen. And the only explanation they have had was a religious, mystical experience. The human beings that time couldn't think about, that there can be the natural explanation for these causes. And we have seen in the Greek mythologies, in the Indian mythologies, that, there was a god dedicated to all these phenomena, the god of fire, the god of, the rains, and so on and so on and so forth. So the Buddha was the first person to seek the natural explanation of everything that human beings experience. And there was another thing that was going on in the philosophical tradition of the world, is to find out the prime substance. So the philosophers or the thinkers were trying to find out what is the prime substance in the world. And the Buddha, when he meditated deeply, when he understood, when he analyzed deeply, he found that the quest for the prime substance, whether you call it fire or water or ether or whatever, or Atma or Paramatma, the quest for the prime substance is futile, because the essence of reality is not absolute. There is nothing absolutism. What he discovered instead of that was that the reality is relational. And this is a very important point, because instead of making a priori assumptions about what goes on in the world, the Buddha taught that we have to examine the world. We have to examine everything. And there is a very beautiful word in the Buddhist tradition. The word is pariksha. Iksha means seeing, and pariksha means 360 degree of seeing. And as we see that the Buddhists were the first people who were trying to examine everything in the light of what is called the theory of cause and effect. Because the Buddha realized that the essence of the reality is relational. There cannot be anything in the world which is independent. There cannot be anything in the world which is permanent. There cannot be anything in the world which is Sanatan. So he didn't have any a priori assumption or any a priori theory to apply. He was looking at the facts of the life. And from that facts of the life, he was trying to find out these solutions. And I think this is a very important point, because this is how the science comes into play. By observation, by experimentation. And the Buddhists were, the first people who developed what is called the rigorous methods of recursive argumentation. If you look at the Buddhist history of thinking, we see that the Buddhist philosophers were trying to examine everything in the light of, finding the evidences. And the Buddha said that never accept anything based on the speculations. The Buddha debarred the speculative thinking. He debarred the mystical thinking. He said that you cannot, be taken away by the religious language. He said even guard the language, the mythical language, because sometimes the mythical language is so, provocative that we tend to become, the slaves of the myths and the language of the religions. So Buddha was the first person who even cautioned against his own dharma. He says that, when you study my dhamma, you should be like a goldsmith who tests the metal with various instruments to see whether, it's pure gold or not. And he says, apply the same method to my teachings as well. So in the ancient India, there was a very important practice. And I'm going to give you that word, what is called the Anvishiki. And Anvishiki is translated in English as the science of inquiry. And if we are studying the methodologies or research methodologies, we know that how do we inquire into something is very important. And there was an entire, a branch developed by the Buddhists called the Anvishiki, which was, sort of a tool, a thinking tool to analyze everything, to have this science of inquiry. And when we look at the way the Buddhists explored everything based on the evidence, they said that we won't believe anything if there is no evidence. And that philosophical tradition, if you look into that, is called the pramana. What is the evidence? What is the base of certain belief? And the Buddha said, examine the base of every single belief. So the Buddha said, you can have a direct evidence, pratyaksha or paroksha. So, the pratyaksha is based on, of course, our senses. Something we see and we say, oh, that is valid. But sometimes we have to, we have to apply what is called the indirect way of creating the evidences. And according to the Indian traditions, there are many ways by which the evidence, the belief can be established. One of them is called the inferential thinking. This is called Anuman in the traditional Indian languages. And then there is the authority. If the Buddha is saying something, let's at least examine what is it. So this, the evidence of authority is very complicated. And the Buddha wanted to keep his disciples away from this. He said that even you examine me. And in the Indian philosophical tradition, there is a tradition which says that we have to believe something as valid because it is written in the scriptures. Veda Pramanyavad or Shabda Pramanya. And the fourth way by which you can make something, establish something as true based on the evidence of your meditative experiences. And I'm going to come to that in the latter part of my talk today. So if you look at the scientific thinking, India was, and the Buddhists were very in the forefront to develop the scientific thinking. And we know that we have had these big universities which Sumesh sir has referred to, Takshashila, Nalanda and all, and they have so many tons of books, books and books. It is said that if we compile the existing Buddhist text in China, they will, if you stack them, they will be like a few-storied building. And, the Buddhists were in the forefront of producing knowledge. And when they were in the forefront of producing knowledge, they were, of course, trying to find out the methods to know something as valid or not. And the method I referred to earlier in my talk, the recursive argumentation method, is about taking an object, analyzing it, creating the way we examine today the hypothesis and reiterating again and again. And in the Central Asia, this teaching has already was well established in the Buddhist viharas there. And it is said by the new research that the Muslims comes in contact with Buddhism in Central Asia, and they take two things from Buddhism: the concept of the colleges, which are viharas, and the universities like Nalanda and Takshashila, and the second thing that they apply for the secular natural world is this recursive argumentation method. And when the West came in contact with the Central Asia or the Muslims, they took these two things: colleges, the system of colleges, and the system of this rigorous method of analysis. So you see that the Buddhist impact on the world is very difficult to imagine at the moment. Just a few days back, there was a discovery of a Buddha statue of 300 AD in what is called Egypt, and that proves the existence of the spread of Buddhism all the way up to Europe. So there is so much to be unearthed, to be digged out, in terms of the impact of Buddhism on the earth. Now there is another thing that is very important, finding in the recent time. It was said that the Shunya is given by the Indians, and when we used to study the Indian history, they used to tell us that unknown Indian. But a few years back, there was a discovery of what is called the Balshaki manuscripts, and it was a Buddhist manuscript discovered in Pakistan, because that is the region where Arai, Jhon, and the manuscripts are secured in the earthen pot and buried. So lots and lots of manuscripts are found there. So in that region, there was a manuscript which was found, which is called the Balshaki manuscript. And when the carbon dating was done, it was found that the Buddhists were using the Shunya as a mathematical concept. And this is very profound, because you cannot think about the science and whose mother is mathematics without the concept of Shunya. So when we are talking about Shunya, we are talking about an abstraction, which is a thinking tool to go back to the world and understand the world as it is. This is a very profound concept. And these two concepts of not assuming anything a priori, not searching for the certainty, not searching for the prime substance, but instead of that, taking the position of a skeptic. In other words, keeping the mind open to new facts, and in the light of new facts, changing our views about the world. So this scientific thinking, which we otherwise call the rationality, has been also one of the hearts of the Buddhism, and that is the gift that the Buddha gave to the world, because he found that nothing exists of its own. There is always the reality is always relational. For example, I am speaking to you. It is not possible because of one cause. There are several causes and conditions which have come together and made this communication possible between me and you. So if you bear this fact of the rational inquiry or the science of inquiry and the logical methods of understanding the truth or finding what is out there by the rigorous methods of inquiry, we can begin to see that how much impact the Buddhism has made on the world. Now I will switch on to the third section of my talk, which is about the economics. The Buddha was the first person who abhorred poverty, who abhorred illiteracy. He abhorred the living conditions of the people if they are not healthy. He was in fact the first person, it is said in the recorded history, who talked about the hygiene. So if you look at the codes of Vinaya, the Buddhist monks were the practitioner of the highest order of hygiene. And there are a lot of researches going on. It is said that the Buddha might be the first person who might have taught about brushing our teeth. He made it a point that his monks brush his teeth. He said that don't eat from the same plate. He said eat separately, so that germs and all won't be they won't spread. And it is said that a lot of people wanted to become the Buddhist monks because the Buddhist Sangha offered them the healthy lifestyle. There was the presence of Jivak, who never became a monk, but whose hospital was always filled with people, and a lot of people used to ready to give a lot of money in order to seek his services. So you see, if you look at the part about the development, the Buddhism is never against development. The Buddhism wants the world to progress in such a way that there will not be any poverty, there will not be any discrimination, there will not be any sort of unhealthy living conditions, there will not be illiteracy, there will not be ignorance. The Buddha said that let the doors of the deathless be open to all, let the knowledge be open to all, men, women, high born, low born, wherever you come from, the knowledge should be open to you all, open to us all. So if you look at this conception of the Buddha is often considered to be related with mind, and it's true. But the Buddha also conceptualized the suffering in terms of the material way. The Buddha said that the wants and the hunger and the paucity, the debt creates a lot of suffering for a human being. So in other words, the Buddha is saying that the human beings have to make progress. So the Buddha was the person, unlike other religions, who never ennobled the poverty. He never said that the poverty is a virtue. He said that if you are poor, that's a very pathetic condition. If you cannot make your both ends meet, that's a very pathetic condition. That's what the Buddha said. So if you see, if we're talking about the economics in terms of how the Buddha conceptualized the world, he never ennobled what is called the poverty. So with this third section, I will move out to the most important section, is about how do we bring the transformation. And I think that's where we have to look into very deeply as to how do we bring the transformation. And if you look at it, today we know that the lot of laboratories in the particular in the West have been trying to understand the Buddhist systems of mindfulness. I won't use the word meditation, I am going to use the word mindfulness. And the way Buddha taught about how we can launch the inquiry into our own experiences, like the experience of body, the experience of our feelings, the experience of mind, and the experience of the reality itself. In the traditional Buddhist parlance, they are called the Satipatthana, Chattaro Satipatthana. The body, Kaya, Vedana, feelings, Chittanupassana, mind, and the Dhammanupassana, the reality itself. How can we cultivate the mindfulness of that? And if you look at in the scheme of the Buddha, the central theme in the Buddha's Dhamma is how we can train our minds. And Baba Sahib Ambedkar has emphasized on the training of mind time again and again in his lot of presentation that we need to find the ways to train the mind. But training the mind is not easy, because it begins with understanding what is the mind. So the first practice is to know what is the mind, to know the mind. And what is the mind? It is said that the mind is so near to us, and it is so unknown. We all experience our mind. It's so near to us. But when we try to know it, it is so unknown. So the first thing that the Buddha taught us, to know your mind, to understand your mind. And it's not easy. But the mind is not something abstract. We can know our mind. If there are certain techniques or methods, which is called the technology of mind, by which we can know our minds. And the second aspect of this training of mind is to shape our minds. To shape our minds. Now, that is so unwieldy, because we all know that how difficult it is to shape our habits, how difficult it is to shape our minds. Because our minds are so obstinate, so unwieldy, and it may turn so pliant. So if we work with our mind, it can become very pliant. It can become prone to shaping. We can transform our minds. And I think that's what the Buddha, give in terms of the training of the mind. And ultimately, we have to free our mind. We have to liberate our minds. So if we look at our minds, our mind is always, in the bondage. Like, the social conditioning, the family conditioning, the cultural conditioning, so on and so forth. Our mind, in other words, is so much conditioned. Our mind is always, in the bondage all over, and you may win freedom here and now. You see, the greatest thing that we can look into Buddhism is that the freedom of the mind is possible here and now. We don't have to wait for tomorrow. If we aspire, if we resolve to cultivate our mind, it's possible to transform our minds. So what I did today is, talk about the 4 aspects which are very crucial for today, and we can look at all of these 4 aspects in the light of what is happening today. For example, what is happening in terms of democracy. Of all the forms of organizing the societies, the form of democracy is the only one, because it gives the individual the respect and reverence. It talks about fraternity. It talks about liberty. It talks about equality. It talks about dignity. It talks about integrity. It talks about unity. It talks about solidarity. So democracy is very important. And from today we have to see that what is happening today, dialectically, in terms of what is happening today, in terms of democracy, in terms of knowing the truth. Are we governed by the dogmas and the superstitious ideas, or are we employing the methods to know the world as it is, the truth as it is? Are we practicing the scientific methods of analysis to know something, to find evidences of certain things? Science. What is happening to the scientific thinking? In terms of the condition of the people, in terms of their material wants, in terms of poverty, in terms of illiteracy, in terms of their well-being, in terms of hygienic conditions, so on and so forth. What is happening there? And the last thing is about education. How can we bring the education which can train our minds in a way that can enable us to know who we are? How does our mind function? How can we shape our minds? And in other way, how we can liberate the minds? And Dr. Baba Ambedkar very early on in 1936 says that the freedom of mind is the most important. Your body can be enslaved. Your body can be in the chains, but your mind can be free. And who is the free man? Dr. Baba Ambedkar says, the man, the person who understands that the law of cause and conditions. In other words, his mind is so exploratory that they try to seek the explanation of everything, and they understand the causes and conditions of everything. For example, if there is suffering, what are the causes and conditions of suffering? If there is dukkha nirod, the end of suffering, what are the causes and conditions of those end of suffering? The Four Noble Truths are the frameworks to apply everywhere in the situation of problems and difficulties. So when we have this mind, this attitude, this open mind of the Buddha, when we have this mind that examines everything, when we have this mind that seeks to find the relationship between different disparate elements and try to find the patterns, and based on trying to finding the patterns, apply them in the society, bring them back to the society in order to transform the world. So these four aspects that I have enumerated today: democracy, science, economics, and the science of mind, how we can bring the transformation. When I'm talking about these four aspects in the Buddhist scheme, they are not different. The Buddha says that you examine inside, you examine outside, ajjata bahida, and then you synthesize both. If you are just examining yourself and not examining what is out there, your experience will be biased, polarized. If you are examining only what is outside there and not examining what is inside there, your experience will be polarized. Find out the middle way. This is the middle way to synthesize the exploration of the world, the investigation of the world with the investigation of the mind that we all have. And when we synthesize these two disparate, so-called disparate, they are not disparate in reality, as the reality is relational. I will just offer a few words about the nature of mind in terms of what is called the nature of mind, in terms of what is called the mind being also not abstract. It's a relational reality, and the mind deep down is also social. It is conditionally produced. There is nothing mystical about human mind. The new theories of consciousness are proving the point that the consciousness is natural. There is nothing mystical. There is nothing religious about consciousness. It is natural. It emerges naturally according to the natural laws and phenomena. So today we are going to think, before I end, in terms of time, and time is very important. That and as Dr. Baba Ambedkar says, that we cannot change the history if we don't understand the history. And if we look at today, what is happening in terms of the democracy in India, what is happening in terms of the scientific exploration, rationality, what is happening in terms of the economics, what is happening in terms of the education to train our minds, to emancipate our minds, we see that there is a glaring contradiction. And this contradiction is not bad, because this contradiction gives us a tool to think through as to what is the ultimate goal that we need to pursue. In terms of a country, we already have a goal to conceive a nation in terms of liberty, equality, fraternity, justice, and that gives us a frame to know where are we in terms of these values, in terms of dignity of the individual, where are we? And when we find this contradiction between, the laws and the morality, what is politically sanctioned, but what is, economically and socially, put down. So we have a degree, we have this very much we have this responsibility today to understand the various, traits that are emerging. So I'm going to talk about a few traits that we need to look at. One of the very important thing that we need to look at in terms of our research work is the social history of Buddhism. As the new evidences are pointing out, even in the 15th century, the Buddha Gaya was active. There was an abbot in Bodh Gaya whose name was Sariputra. And, there are evidences that there were Buddhists in some pockets. And if we study the philosophies or the teachings of some of the great people like Kabir, Raidas, who came from the so-called non-Vedic backgrounds, if you look at, these teachings of this Kabir, great Kabir, Raidas, we find the resonances of the Buddha's teachings. They talk about, Prempur, they talk about Begumpura, they talk about, the new world, they talk about, how to create a society which is not based on discrimination, which is not based on, superstitious ideas, which is not based on lack of, which is not based on hunger, which are based on, educating the minds of the people. So we can definitely see that the Buddhism as a social culture is still there. And there are a lot of studies, like in South, there was a study done by P.C. Alexander in 1948, where he shows the Buddhist roots of the community called the Nair community. Then we have a similar study done by Hariprasad Sastri, a great Buddhist scholar from Bengal, who says that if we examine properly, we can see the Buddhist in every village in Bengal. And then we have this tradition of Mahima Dharma. And if we start to examine the roots of Warkari tradition in Maharashtra, we can come to what is called the Pandharpur, or the concept of Panduranga or Pundarika. They are the resonances of the Buddha's teachings. So as a researcher, we have to understand the social history, the social anthropology, of the various communities, and find out, where are their roots. Just to give you an idea, if a larger mass of the people are debarred to learn the so-called, the Vedic Brahmanical scriptures, then what were the 85% of the people in this country doing? What were they reading? What was their faith? What were they studying? That's a very important question that I would like to put to all of you today. So that's one area that we need to examine the social histories of various communities, and try to find out how they are related to these egalitarian traditions. The second area that we need to look into is the Indian history, because there is a lot of distortion about Indian history. Ashoka, nobody knew about Ashoka before 200 years. His name was completely vanished. Even the name of the Buddha was there, but who is the Buddha, nobody knew. It took a lot of years to unearth these facts that the Buddha was born in Lumbini. Had it not been for the decipherment of the Ashokan script, we would have not even known the Indian history. Because the Indian material history begins with Ashoka. Ashoka provides us the material evidences of what happened. There is no history before the Buddha. There is no history before Ashoka. All the material evidences of Indian history comes from there. So we have to understand the history of our country. When I was talking about the Dharma in the first section of it, the Ashoka completely revolutionized the concept of Dharma. It is said by the scholars that he was the first person to use the word Dharma in that way. He was the first person who talked about, for example, if you look at the intellectual history of India, the Ahimsa word is never found in any Vedic tradition. It is the gift of the Buddha. The word karma is not found in the Vedic tradition. It's a gift of the Buddha. He says that we have to do the action in the world so that we can reform the world. We cannot be mealy-mouthed. We have to act in the world. We have to engage with the world. And engaging with the world is the basic Buddhist practice. So this is the second area that I would like to highlight today in terms of, how we are going to understand, see the history in the light of the new evidences, archaeological and historical evidences that are coming into play today. And when I was talking about economics, the economics of want and hunger, we have to look into that very seriously. As a country, we know that there are 30% of people, they are living below the poverty line. They have no way by which they can make their both ends meet, and it's none of their fault. There are structural, realities which makes an individual, completely slave. And as Baba Ambedkar says, when the ethics and economy is in conflict, it's the economy that always succeeds. So, this is one of the areas that we have to look into when we are talking about the Buddhist, scholarship. When we are talking about the ethics, we have to venture into the comparative study of the religions. And Dr. Baba Ambedkar wanted to make it a point that in his institution, which he wanted to found in Bangalore, he wanted to make it a point that the student study the the religions comparatively. The comparative study is a very important, intellectual tool to understand anything. And he was so critical in his thought process. He says that in my seminary there will be another book that the student might need to study critically, with the open mind, with the mind of an with the mind of an examination. And that book was to be the Buddha and his Dhamma. Even he did not make it his book dogmatic. He says that my book is also open to criticism, because he embodied the tradition of the Buddha, that you have to have the open and clear mind that will be serviceable to the humanity. You cannot become the slaves of the ideas. We cannot become the slaves of the ideologies. We have to examine the world. We have to make some ideas as workable and send them out in the world. That is what is the job of the philosopher, as Dr. Baba Ambedkar said. So, the philosophical exploration in the Buddhist history, because if you see the Brahminical philosophical system, they are nothing but responding to the Buddhist philosophy. You pick up Kumarila, you pick up Shankara, you pick up anybody, they are responding to the Buddhist, invisible Buddhists. There is a civic silence over Buddhism, but they are always responding to the Buddhism. The interaction between the Islam and Buddhism. What happened in the Sindh? What happened in Afghanistan? How does that transform, the Islam? You see, there are this lot of areas where we need to focus on, give attention to, so that we can understand what has happened and how that is applicable today. The last area which I will come to, and I think that's very important for us, is the exploration of the methods that the Buddhists have developed, and how you can bring them incompatible with science. If any religion is not compatible with the science, it will become a ridiculous thing. If we keep on harping the tune that we are born of some God and we have not evolved, but the evidences are saying that we have evolved, then we are making the religion very ridiculous. So how to make things compatible with the scientific process of knowing the things, of understanding the world. It is not that we will know everything today, but gradually we might begin to understand everything as it is happening. We began with thinking that the earth is flat. We began with a lot of wrong thinking, but eventually, because of the advancement in the thinking, development of the thinking tools, development of the evidences, we could now know what it is. And maybe one day we will know everything what it is. So the skeptic mind is very important. As a researcher, the Buddhist mind should be the mind of a skeptic. And Christopher Beckwith, he says that the skepticism to the West has been derived from the Buddhist philosophy. There was with Alexander, one gentleman came whose name was Pyro, and Pyro came in contact with the Buddhists in Gandhara in the present day Pakistan, and he took up this concept of not accepting anything just based on dogma, but to examine everything, to have a skeptic mind. And it is said that David Hume was very much influenced by the thinking of Pyro. In other words, not to have the fixed mind, not to have fixity of the ideas, keeping the mind fluid, keeping the mind ready to learn new things. So there is a lot more I can say today, but I thought that these four areas, and the looking at the contradictions of what is happening today, and the future that we can all envision together, is very much summarized in the act that Dr. Baba Ambedkar did before he left us. So what he did, he found that in Buddhism, there was only Sangha Diksha. The people could become the member of the Sangha. And he found that not having Dhamma Diksha was a great handicap to Buddhism. Because in the absence of the institutional Buddhism, the Buddhism disappeared. So what he did, a radical thing that he did, was to institute the practice of Dhamma Diksha. And when we take the Dhamma Diksha, we commit ourselves to this vision of a world, the vision of the individuals, The vision of the Buddha is to make, to enable everybody to become the light of their own. In other words, to, enable everybody to become the Buddha, be their own light. And to create the world into a true fraternity. That is the meaning of the Sangha. True democracy. That is the meaning of the Sangha. But in order to do that, we have to have a complete faith in the Dhamma. We have to, in other words, take the Dhamma Diksha. And that was his last radical act, but not insignificant. One of my friends, he's coming from the African American tradition, he's a Buddhist. And once I was going, I was with him in Diksha Bhumi, and he saw a photo of Baba Saheb Ambedkar after the Dhamma Diksha. And Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar is sitting relaxed, as if his job is done. There is nothing left to be done. He has done what was to be done. He has handed over. In other words, he has nothing left to be done. He has done his responsibility. What was it? He has handed over to us the three precious jewels: the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha. And if we understand these three precious jewels, the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, in terms of the background or the logical system that Baba Saheb Ambedkar has so beautifully constructed and given to us, we cannot forget his Mahamantra, which he talked about in 1941. He said that we have to recite that Mahamantra in 1941 if we have to bring democracy in this country. I would say if we have to bring the scientific vision in this country, if we have to bring a society which is free from the want and hunger, if we have to create a society which is thinking, which is a society that thinks. It is not governed by any alternative truth. It is not governed by anything ideological sort of ignorance. If we want to bring this, we have to even today repeat the great mantra, Mahamantra, that Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar has given in 1941. Buddhang Saranam Gacchami, Dhammang Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami. So I will stop here today, and I will open up the forum for any question and answers.
Yes, sir.
Yes.